nationalism and racism, the sacrificial grace and Christian opposition. He was one of the first and very few to speak out against the Nazis and to follow through with active resistance. He resisted Nazi intrusions into the life of the German church and the impact of Nazi bigotry on Jews and others excluded from full participation in German society. During his time in New York City, at Union Theological Seminary and at Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem, where he visited for a period of time, he witnessed the impact of racism in the United States. Identifying with the oppressed in both the United States and Germany, he said the Church of Christ lives in all people beyond all national, political, social, and racial boundaries, offering an ecumenical vision of the Christian church that greatly transcends Christian nationalism and national socialism. He moved from academic and pastoral ministry to direct action against Nazi oppression by smuggling Jews out of Germany, using ecumenical context to spread word about resistance to the Nazis, and seeking the overthrow of Nazi leadership. And he was self-sacrificing in his devotion to public activism. He saw that God's love for the world and incarnational Christian spirituality could be expressed through political action. He expressed faith through prayer and justice, not in powerful religious organizations, and saw a future form of the church that might be unexpected, non-religious in a conventional sense, but able to convert and transform. He consistently sacrificed his own safety to resist the oppression of the German people while expressing the unity of faith and action in the world through sacrificial grace. So that's an introduction. So I just want to see, does anyone have a question or thought, possibly based on reading or other things that you've heard about Bonhoeffer, before I plunge into the text itself? Also, if you've got a question, I just want to make sure it doesn't get scrolls out. Yes, ma'am.
I didn't read it, but I will because I wanted to be here to listen. Yeah. And this is just my not fully knowing all my history regarding what was happening in Germany. What was happening in churches, Catholic churches, Lutheran church, obviously I know it was happening in synagogues and other those religions, but.
Yeah. Well, the short answer to that, and we'll get more details on this in the text itself, but I'd say many of the churches were co-opted by the Nazis. I mean, they had, it was like the Reich bishop, the Reich this, and it became kind of like a subsection of the government. And even to the point I mentioned this in the text, there was a reissuing of the Bible. It had 12 commandments instead of 10, to obey your Führer is right up there with the other things like honor father and mother and all this. And many German pastors put photographs of Hitler on the altar, which, again, is just stunning. Of course, I always have a little bit of a problem, even now we have like the national flag and the church, and it's kind of like, we kind of have a separation of these things. But anyway, just to say it was co-opted. There are more details that I'll give, but just to say, and a minority of the church resisted the German Nazi regime's control over the church. And so we have things like the Barmen Declaration and the Confessing Church movement, which was a minority. But even there, that's all they did was confine themselves to resisting the government's control of the church. A famous, fairly famous German Christian pastor, writer, theologian, if you will, named Niemeyer, had been a German submarine commander in World War I. So, he had the military credentials. If he kept his mouth shut, he could have probably gotten another submarine to command. But he had become a pastor, and he resisted the regime's control over the church. And for that and that alone, he was put in jail and not allowed to get back in. He volunteered to go be a submarine commander, and he wanted to do that. They suspected it. But I'm saying, what was missing in even that minority response was a protest of what was happening in the wider world. which included not just, say, at one point, Germans of Jewish origin, or Jewish ancestry, whatever, or even those married to a Jewish person or other kind of excluded groups could take on certain roles in society, including being a pastor. So that was part of what Bonhoeffer did, was part of this underground church movement where they said, well, if the above ground seminaries can't train pastors of Jewish origin, we'll have to do that underground. And so they did that, and seminaries were closed down. He was ordered to cease and desist from preaching, teaching, publishing as part of the regime's, pushing back against him. But I guess the picture to paint of him is very much in a minority, and very much isolated in his willingness to directly push back against the regime, and not just in church matters, not just like we get to decide what our doctrine is going to be, or we get to decide those things, but in the wider, wider world, in the wider church. One of the statements, he made several statements like this, but was if a maniac is driving down the street and killing people, one response would be, well, to try to bandage and bind up and help the people who've been run over, but maybe to stop the maniac from running over more people. Like to say, to put a weapon through the spokes of the wheel so the wheel doesn't continue to turn. And he felt that was his responsibility to do. So he felt very committed to be a part of the resistance and part of what was happening. So he was, at one point, left Germany, and actually, as I alluded to before, came to the United States. He was a student and also did some, I think, teaching at a later time at Union Seminary in New York, but he got a scholarship and was at Union. And while he was at Union, he found his way into the Abyssinian Baptist Church and the whole black church tradition. So one of the authors, Reggie Williams, I believe, who I quote, writes a book called Black Jesus, but it emphasizes the impact on Bonhoeffer of his time at Abyssinian Baptist Church in New York. And
What years was he in New York?
Oh, I'd have to tell you that. I'll have to look at that. This was 30s. That 30s when this was kind of going on. And he was there for a period of time and then went away and then came back for more like a visit. So there were actually 2 visits. But part of what that also reflected is friends, supporters of him, were trying to get him out of Germany. And you don't have to do this, you don't have to die, basically. Because he wasn't going to just kind of look the other way, so to speak. So at one point, he was pastor of a German, say like he was a Lutheran pastor in a couple of congregations in Great Britain. So he actually had time there. He was also in Spain at one time, and then he was in America. But basically, he felt that he could not be part of the future of Christianity, the future of life in Germany, if he sort of sat safely on the sidelines while all the terrible things were happening. And so I found that to be characteristic of his approach to Germany in this period, because on multiple occasions he turned to do the more risky thing because he felt it was a more faithful thing to do. So in other words, he could have easily had multiple altars. He could have easily stayed in America and not returned. Having returned to Germany, he could have, so to speak, kept his head down, but he got involved in things like, again, she's fine. We love dogs. The church movement, again, the underground church movement, the helping of Jews to escape the regime. And so in other words, he could have returned to Germany and just been a quiet person, but he didn't do that. Ultimately, he was arrested for, among other things, his role in helping Jews out. He also he wore multiple hats. So he was in the Abwehr, which was military intelligence. He was recruited for that, but he was recruited by those a small pocket of resistors within the Nazi regime itself. And his brother-in-law was one of them, and so he was recruited. But he had an international presence as an ecumenist, and so he was known for that. But what that did is it gave him credence, gave him an excuse, gave him an ability to travel outside Germany when passports to get out weren't readily available. Now, for being in the German, military intelligence, in other words, there was an excuse like, well, gosh, he can use his credentials to go abroad and he can bring back reports that can be part of the intelligence. And he did. And his reports were very innocuous, but he was serving literally as a double agent. And so that enabled him to make contacts with others outside Germany, especially Bishop Bell of Chichester in Great Britain, the Church of England, who he did a lot to inform about the resistance movement. So in other words, it was his hope that Hitler could be overthrown, that would end the war, and then it would be possible to have a greater cooperation. I was like, well, what happens to Germany after that? What happens if they could stop Hitler? What happens if they could stop the regime? So the idea of trying to encourage cooperation that could take place. The conspiracy, this is a conspiracy that's real. It's not, the conspiracies we tend to hear about tend to be very unreal, but this was a real conspiracy that he was a part of, including to assassinate Hitler. But when he was arrested, the Nazis didn't know that he'd been a part of that. They did know that he'd done things like publicly challenge the regime. One of the early broadcasts that he made after Hitler came to power, he was on like Radio Germany, whatever, and Radio Berlin, and he questioned the role of Führer as leader, and he said that if the Führer as leader would not prevent the followers from idolizing him, that he would become a misleader. And the idea of this unquestioned allegiance to this powerful person who, of course, all, shreds of democracy had been whisked aside by this regime. And that he warned that if they didn't distinguish themselves from this, it would be a misleader. And again, the idea of this sort of conflation of Nazi outlook and attitudes with Christianity that he was, of course, was a part. I mean, that they downplayed the role of Jews in our tradition. I mean, the Old Testament is filled. I mean, Jesus was a Jew, as were all these good figures of the Old Testament. That was being sort of downplayed as sort of an Aryan Jesus. It's okay to interact and interject. Victoria at her university has a colleague who has a non-Aryan background, but who has a stuffed white Jesus. So the joke is, where is white Jesus? Because Jesus wasn't white. Not in an Aryan sense. So the idea of how that was played down by the authorities who were looking to the final solution to eradicate the Jews. Well, Bonhoeffer sought to resist that by actively smuggling Jews out of the country, and his position, I believe, within the institution for a time enabled him to do that. But it changed, because eventually, after the assassination attempt, there was one major attempt to assassinate Hitler. It obviously didn't work, and then it was kind of like poking the bear. So then there was an investigation to see who was involved, and he was discovered to be a part of that. The famous, what's called the Zosin files. Zosin's a little suburb, I mean, kind of like Waukesha or something relative to Milwaukee. And anyway, of course, there's something I have to say. I've got some German background, so nothing against the German people as such, but I found it to be very administratively motivated. So here, the conspirators who have conspired, to kill Hitler, they saved all their paperwork. I mean, they're such good bureaucrats, they couldn't bear it. Well, we'll need this in the future. So instead of, some say, well, gosh, we've got to destroy this, but no. But instead, they hid it in the intelligence. They say there was like a Zosin satellite office of the Abwehr, and so they hid it in an obscure place in like the library or the books function or something of the like little satellite office in Zosin. But it got a seat, we have seats, lots of seats, please.
How did he manage to avoid arrest for as long as he did? Even for just his open resistance?
Yes.
I would have thought the Nazi regime wouldn't have any qualms about arresting anyone speaking
Well,
out.
you're right, and I guess he was seen as a pastor, which he was. So he was. Well, he was silenced. I guess that's what I'd say is, at first they just silenced him. They officially said he should not publish, preach, or teach. So he was also.
So he was doing that sort of in the underground.
Yeah, that's right. He was this sort of underground
Yeah.
movement within to seminaries. Which like here we've got like whatever the Shona House, and it's publicized and big signs on top of it. This would have been like maybe in a home or in a private space that wouldn't have publicized that. But again, it became known what he was doing, and he was eventually arrested. But I say the things that he was arrested for initially were not the most serious things. It was only later, after this file that had very explicit material that implicated his role in the conspiracy, and after that, things started to change drastically for him, and it eventually led to his execution. Very, very shortly before the end of the war. The Flossburg camp where he was executed was liberated in a matter of weeks. It was like in April. So if it was.
If he died April 9th.
April 9th, that's right. It was within 2 weeks that the Allies came. So it was that close. Indeed, it was as Hitler personally ordered his execution and that of others just weeks before that at a noon meeting. This thing stick in your head. I wonder if he had lunch after that, but anyway, it was, as I recall, it was a noon meeting where he personally directed the Bonhoeffer to be executed. He was hung. So, but anyway, that's a long answer to your question. But I'm glad to just kind of bounce off questions if there are some. Anything else that comes to mind? Okay. Well, let me plunge in. This gives more dates and specifics, so I'll just kind of pause after a bit and see if anything comes. So, Bonhoeffer was a German who risked greatly as a Christian witness. He was a Lutheran pastor, scholarly lecturer in systematic theology, and sacrificed his life to resist Nazi control. And so I mentioned the worrying about a misleader, and he denounced on the wireless a political system which corruptly and grossly misled a nation and made the Fuhrer its idol god. His activism, one of his things he stated his ethics: the first task given to those who belong to the Church of God is not to be something for themselves, for example, by creating a religious organization or leading a pious life, but to be witnesses of Jesus Christ in the world. And his ecumenical context were themselves suspect, and a good reason to understand this was, he pointed out, that the Christianity goes beyond bounds or connections of national identity, family identity, racial identity. So it points to this faith that takes those into account, but surpasses all of them. And, in Christ there is no east or west. I mean, that, and indeed reaching beyond denominational boundaries. So that attitude was not well prized by a government that's trying to make the ultimate allegiance a national government. We're here for the fatherland. We're here, and that this fatherland is somehow better than other fatherlands. Anyway, he was kind of pulling in a different direction. One of Williams, I mentioned Reggie Williams and Black Jesus. One of his points that he emphasizes was that Bonhoeffer may have been ahead of his time in Germany in recognizing the threat of what was going on as Hitler, as the Nazis, National Socialism increasingly marginalized the Jews and others of non-Aryan descent. In other words, he had seen racial prejudice in his time in the United States and how the blacks were put in second-class roles, excluded. And indeed, Hitler had seen that too, but he took it entirely differently. I mean, Hitler once said, well, here in Europe, we're weak. Whereas look at these Americans. They've learned to be strong. They've taken aggressive steps to sort of separate the races. So in a sense, you could say they were emboldened by what we had done. But Bonhoeffer, going back, warned, this is not good. This is not good. So that's Williams's point, that the oppression of the Jews, he'd seen already the oppression of blacks and could see parallels because of how perilous that could be for a society, for a country, for a nation. And again, the concern that the church, as the church, even the confessing church, didn't resist that when they said, well, if you're not of Aryan ancestry, you can't be a pastor. And they just kind of rolled over on that. They didn't fight it as a body. There was resistance in the confessing church movement, what's called the Barmen Declaration, that it led to, but it was just saying the church needs to be the church. The church needs to set its own doctrine, set its own discipline, and so forth. But it didn't reach beyond that. So just a few details on that. What's known as Aryan paragraph was first enacted on April 7, 1933 in the Third Reich by the, quote, law for the restoration of the professional civil service to restrict civil service employment to persons of Aryan descent. Those with Jewish parents or grandparents were excluded from civil service. It was later expanded to exclude those married to a non-Aryan. This was followed by the law against the overcrowding of German schools and universities, which extended the Aryan paragraph to education in Germany. That was April 25th, 1933. In the summer of 1933, German Christians proposed to exclude non-Aryans from serving as clergy or religious leaders, and the Reich Church's Constitution of July 14, 1933 was silent on the application of the Aryan paragraph to education, including theological faculties, which had already ruled out any possibility of a new generation of pastors of Jewish descent. So,
Was it easier to do that because it was a state church?
yeah, precisely.
I mean,
Precisely.
pastors were employed by the
Right,
state.
right. They set state rules
Right.
for what could be. But, yeah. But you can see it just reaching out, just reaching further and further. And that's part of how, to my understanding, Bonhoeffer was, if you will, recruited to the conspiracy, is the general public in all cases didn't know the horrors that were being inflicted upon the Jews. I mean, that was just, everybody may not have known the depth and breadth of what was happening. So that when he was given evidence of this, like, well, something has to be done. Anyway, any other thoughts or questions about that? So Bonhoeffer supported the confessing church movement that opposed the German Christian movement. The German Christian movement meaning the Nazi faith, and the co-opting of the church as an instrument of Nazi propaganda and politics, which again is sort of like you say, in fact, it mocks God. It's turning God into a prop for the regime. It's making, just putting God, faith, into a supporting role subordinated to a political, power, political structure. What if I can skip over to one of my other favorite sources, William Stringfellow and others, we might talk about as a principality in power, an embodied evil, if you will. So the confessing church movement stood in opposition to the Nazification of Christianity, and Nazi religious beliefs and changes should not be accorded biblical or doctrinal authority. It was almost seen by those who were believing it that way as complementary, as like an enhancement, an extension of the gospel. Kind of like, well, we believe, I think it's good theology to say the gospel continues to be translated, it continues to be understood anew, but this is just, it's making a pivot. It's turning in a whole different direction that, again, subordinated to a political movement that was ultimately being used as a prop. So there's this. Another just major feature of Bonhoeffer's work, many of you have probably heard of this, but his most famous book, he wrote many, is The Cost of Discipleship. And in that book, he, again, we talked about before, a disciple is a follower, like a follower of Christ. So in that book, he sets up the terms of costly grace and cheap grace. So what he says is, you say, well, I know God will forgive me, so I can just do what I please, and the forgiveness will be there, and I don't need to lift a finger. But he says, in a way, you need costly grace. The grace is free, but the paradox is it costs everything. And so it's really not free. And in a sense, I say, isn't that true of love? I mean, love is free, you don't have to pay for it, but yet it costs everything. It costs your whole being. And anything less than giving your whole being is a holding back. So, as I said, if Bonhoeffer didn't take the opportunity to play it safe, in other words, he could have been a guest lecturer probably at Union Seminary or somewhere and sat out the war in New York City, but felt compelled to go back. But then when he went back, he got involved in public opposition to the regime, like being on the radio and warning that if the regime didn't renounce idolatry, it would be a misleading regime. But then even more publicly, ultimately, in terms of the people being involved in helping Jews to escape capture, helping the conspiracy to move forward. So he was a part of the discussions concerning how to overthrow the regime, indeed how to stop Hitler, how to kill Hitler. But those were decisions that he made that he didn't have to make. And then even after his arrest, he protected others, and he lied frequently, denied his involvement. I mean, I'm a big fan of honesty, but in this context, he lied. And I think that was the moral thing to do. Just as, say, if a person were hiding a Jew and the Nazis came to the door and said, "Have you seen any Jews?" Well, actually, the honest answer would be, "Why, yes, I've got 3 hiding in my head." But the moral answer, I say, would be, "No, not me." Not. But anyway, he put himself more at risk by not cooperating after his arrest, but rather resisting. And indeed, he was offered opportunities of escape, like, well, we will help you to escape. He said, I don't want to. One, he was concerned that if he did escape, friends and family members might be punished in his absence. But also, I believe he had a sense of finding his vocation in incarceration, in the prison. He served as like a chaplain to the other prisoners and helped them. He wrote, and cooperative guards helped to smuggle out his writings as a separate volume, Letters from Prison. Many writings, and I quote some of his passages of those, but that ultimately he didn't want to give that up. He wanted to stand with the people who were facing these challenges.
He was unmarried, right?
Well, he was engaged.
Yeah.
He was engaged. He was unmarried, but Maria was much younger than him. But anyway, they were engaged, and she visited him in jail at times. They made plans for what their wedding would look like. But he, in a way, I think the Nazis could kind of use that to try to, well, gosh, we may be able to have more visits from your beloved Maria if you would just be a little more cooperative. But,
How long was he in jail?
2 years is my memory. Kind of April to April. Much of it in a less restricted confinement where he was able, as I said, to have visitors, have his writings kind of distributed, but he had visitors who came and saw him in jail. But then after the discovery of his role in the conspiracy, that ended abruptly. He wasn't having visitors, and his writings weren't getting out. He was being moved from place to place until he was finally executed. Okay.
Do you see any parallels between what was going on in his time and what's going on now here and in
Yes, as a matter of fact, I did.
Funny you should ask.
Funny you ask that question. The whole idea of idolizing a national leader who can do no wrong, alternative truth, the subjugation of religion for a political purpose, the ordering of loyalty, political loyalty that supersedes fundamental, Christian teaching of kindness, gentleness, mercy, generosity, inclusiveness, just fundamentals. Blessed are the peacemakers, blessed are the poor. I think so. To me, that's why I think, the article has gotten attention. It's like the Journal of Ecumenical Studies is based at Temple University, and there's sort of a sister organization called the Dialogue Institute, which puts on presentations and conferences and publishes a blog. So their blog post about this article is what you all saw in the
What's
newsletter.
your article about? What's the focus of your article?
Well, the article is, it's just telling Bonhoeffer's story, but specifically, I'm kind of circling around that, is the idea of costly grace, and which again is a core concept in his well-respected, well-known book, The Cost of Discipleship. But the thing I just want to say, so the Dialogue Institute chose this article, and I don't think it's not yay rah, but it's so timely. I think that's what did that. It's so timely. But anyway, back in terms of the focus in costly discipleship, one of the things he says is that this costly discipleship certainly involves sacrifice. So for him, that he chose not to sit out the war in a safe place, but to return to Germany. He chose to have a public opposition to Hitler. He chose to involve himself with those who were literally going to put a spike in the spokes of the wheel to stop what was happening, and not just like, I'm going to write another nice article about this, but he was going to do his best to stop it. And as an incarcerated person, he did whatever he could to protect the others and to continue to put himself, in effect, at risk. So there was that. But when he talked about it, he said when he first wrote Cost of Discipleship as a sort of an earlier work, he saw it as, like his own faithfulness, like trying to be a saint, like live a saintly life, become this person. But the more he thought about it, he said, this is not a self-help project. It's really abandoned into the arms of God. It's sort of like, that's the title, which I picked up, thrown into God's arms. So in other words, he's doing his best to live out a faithful life. One of his famous writings from the prison was like, who am I? Who am I? Am I the person who, does these things? Am I the person who, stands for these principles? Am I the person who tries to, who am I? He ultimately is like this repetition. He ultimately comes down to, I'm just trying to do what I understand God's will to be. And that's all I can do. And he said once that he wrote from prison, if this is the end, and this was, I think, after the attempt on Hitler's life had been unsuccessful, and it's going to, maybe inevitably this was going to come and bite him. If this is the end, my life makes sense to me. It makes sense to me in terms of this embrace of costly grace, that he's literally put himself on the line. And that's his heroism. But it's held up for others. It's like in our own ways we can be witnesses to this. We can make these statements. And it's not about a self-improvement project. It's not like I'm giving up chocolate for Lent or something. But it's like I'm abandoning myself, like Dietrich says, abandonment to divine providence, abandonment to divine love. And so that's what he does. And he, there's this reportedly scene where at his execution they say, Pastor, you tremble. He says, I'm cold. It's just like, but he does it in faith. And it's not that he doesn't care about his life. He would love to live. He'd love to marry his beloved Maria. He'd love to go forward. But he sees this as his calling. So that's a sinner. It's costly grace. And that's how he lives it out. There's a quote of his that I put in the end here, which I think I can find about so much. It says, if one has completely renounced making something of oneself, whether it be a saint or a converted sinner or a church leader, a so-called priestly figure, a just and unjust person, a sick or a healthy person, then one throws oneself completely into the arms of God. And this is what I call this worldliness, living fully in the midst of life's tasks, questions, successes and failures, experiences and perplexities. Then one takes seriously no longer one's own sufferings, but rather the suffering of God in the world. Then one stays awake with Christ in Gethsemane. So he talks about there's really it's only one world. I mean, it's not like there's heaven above and earth below. I mean, it's all one world. And so there's no true worldliness without spirituality, and there's no true spirituality without it being lived out in the world. I mean, it's a strong focus on action. It's not just having bright ideas. And as I'm fond of saying, Jesus and his disciples could have had a fascinating theological discussion on Friday afternoon on Good Friday, but instead he dies on the cross. I mean, it's an action. And so it's a faith in action. It's not just a set of nice concepts. And so that's kind of just what he does. So I conclude here, Bonhoeffer's radical Christian discipleship calls him to embrace new and dangerous circumstances as he returned to Germany, where he was silenced, imprisoned, and hanged by the Nazis. His execution was a great loss for the church, his country and his family and friends. But it was not for Bonhoeffer a tragedy. He explained in the Gospel of Discipleship that to endure the cross is not a tragedy. It's the suffering which is the fruit of an exclusive allegiance to Jesus Christ. When it comes, it's not an accident, but a necessity. So I write, it was Bonhoeffer's costly grace and sacrifice. So, thrown into God's arms. Any thoughts? Any
He
questions?
probably, as he lived it out, and he probably became more and more radical,
Right,
at least within himself.
right.
And why?
No, right, I just agree.
Yeah.
I think you're right. I think you
Right.
can see a growing momentum. I'm told
Yeah.
his participation with the conspirators, at first he's just sort of there, and sort of growing more so. He became more and more a part of
He
that.
probably saw the terrific danger in to the country, to the people, not to himself. It snowballed
Yeah.
within him.
Another piece of that, again, is religionless Christianity. I mean, I'm a person of religion, obviously I'm sitting here in clericals, but I think he was deeply hurt and dismayed by the church's inactivity in the face of a Nazi regime. I say what was a little phrase I used? It went from apathetic to anemic to complicit. I mean, I think he just felt like, where is the church in this? Where's the Christian witness?
Hiding. They're
Yeah,
scared.
I mean, they're scared. I mean, and again, even the ones who stood up to him, got put in jail or they're restricted and all that, they were just talking about the church as church and not what's going on around us.
What was the Confessing Church movement?
Well, just that. In other words,
Who were they? I mean,
well, people who, you could say, people who signed the Barmen Declaration, but the Confessing Church was in opposition to what was the German church, which was the Reich Church, which was the church that had taken on Nazism, the church that had a Bible with 12 commandments, the church that had Hitler's picture on the altar.
was it organized?
Yeah, it was organized. I mean, well, the Confessing Church may have been a movement, but the Barmen Declaration, but still, it didn't go very far. I mean, I think that was one of Bonhoeffer's complaints. I mean, something like 80%, I have to read through this to find the exact, something like 80% of the Confessing Church movement pastors signed a loyalty oath to Hitler. They were, we're loyal, we just want to be able to run the church. We want to do our church stuff without your interference. But yeah, I mean, we're not worried about all that other stuff. We're loyal. And that, I think he just had deep dismay with that. So I mean, that's what he said. The only thing we have left is prayer and seeking justice. And he talked about a future church that he thought might be, and this he wrote his nephew for like his baptism. I believe this is where that came from, who was named for him, as I recall. He wrote a letter like, well, what will be the church that he will grow up to see? And maybe it'll be something very different from what we've seen so far. I mean, the religionless, but not in terms of its outward doctrine and its administrative hierarchy and trying to have, better buildings or something like that. But it'll be speaking the truth and speaking a faith that converts and transforms. And I think he felt that, the church has lost its voice. I mean, like I say, it came down with laryngitis in a time of crisis. So he envisioned a church that might be very different, that would be full voiced, that would have a full sound system. Everything would be fully turned on. So that's what he calls us to. So it's a radical approach, and I think he becomes increasingly, like I say, I think that's a good insight, radicalized, but it's a radical faith in a time when the church around him seemed to be just out to kind of go along to get along, just kind of, well, that's sorry about your luck, but we're going to be back Sunday morning and we'll sing Mighty Fortress or something. So, anyway, so Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I will say, for my purposes, this is going to be, I hope, a chapter in a book about war and faith, where in times of war, whether declared or not declared, you may see a parallel theme. I also co-edited a book, Fearful Times of Living Faith, but in the times of greatest challenge, fear, controversy, that we may show what we're about. We may claim the faith that is in us, and when we do, that may be some of the best versions of it we find. So the idea of that book was to have different people write about the living faith they were discovering in the fearful times, certainly the pandemic, but also some of the other great stresses that we face today, politically, in terms of the treatment of people, minorities, others. So in a sense, for me, this is part of a larger work that we might see as Fearful Times of Living Faith. Anyway, so thank you for the opportunity to share this with you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And I'll send, there'll be official reprints of the article that should be available soon, so I'll send them to Kevin, maybe put them on the little desk out here.